Okay, so I wanted to continue acclimatizing myself into speaking in front of the recordings. And this one, I wanted to talk about this podcast that I've watched of Dr. Jordan Peterson and Dr. Ian, who've written a book called The Master and Its Emissary, and it talks about the specialization of the brain into two centers, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. The left one is more responsible, focusing on things and basically immobilizing the thing into the frame. So it's more of a predatory side of the brain. But one thing that is very important to keep in mind for predators is that they don't want to become the prey of something else. So, yes, the brain has to keep in mind or focus on the prey, but also stay wary of becoming the prey. And that's what led to, maybe it's not what led to the right hemisphere development, but these two parts are necessary. So the right part of the brain focuses on the global scheme of things and focuses on the overall picture. You categorize the thing or you transform the thing into bits, but you also keep in mind that there's the thing as a whole. And I actually was hesitant to say that that's what led to the right hemisphere because based on the oldest neural networks that were found, they were asymmetrical, so there isn't a proof that one developed before the other. Mm, so I'm going to read from my notes and see the points that I can talk about. Okay, so I basically explained why we need the right and the left hemisphere, but just to recap, this conversation isn't just about biology. So if the left hemisphere is responsible for viewing the thing as a whole, while the left hemisphere is about focusing on things and grasping things, basically, there's a lot of concepts that are more attributed to one side than the other one. And one can view these concepts not only attributed to biological beings, but also to nations, for instance, or periods of time, or political movements. Yeah. And this thing is further proven when there's an injury or a problem in one of the hemispheres. So when there's a problem in the left hemisphere, you can say that the person finds it hard to, say, move the part that is associated with the left hemisphere. So maybe you will get your arm paralyzed simply by having your left hemisphere, a part of it injured. So it's more of a action thing, I guess. But when the right hemisphere is injured, you get a sort of hallucination or you get more of a lack of understanding of the world. Maybe the part that is responsible for you being aware of the existence of your right arm is injured by your right hemisphere being injured, and I use right arm and right hemisphere at the same time, hopefully not to confuse the listener. But what I'm getting into is that the right hemisphere is responsible for the understanding of the world. And why did I bring that up? So some patients, when they get their right hemisphere injured or something, it completely changes how they view the world. For instance, some people deny the existence of their arms or their legs, and they the left side of their hemisphere is like trying to come up with suggestions or solutions, not solutions, but trying to grasp the thing even though it's not logical. Maybe it's logical, but it's not the truth. And so, yeah, once again, the right hemisphere knows more of the truth, but it also knows that it needs the left hemisphere, but the left hemisphere is like, the superior one, I'm the one that understands, but it doesn't. So that's what a part of the discussion was about. Yeah, and there's also a part of the discussion that talks about anorexics and people with the body images problems. So they they forget how to view the thing as a whole inside of a body or compared to the global image of how that body disfiguration is for other people, for instance. So they just focus on the body disfiguration and they forget how to they it's not that they forget, but the fact that they have an issue with their right hemisphere makes them no longer able to view the full picture and to view that disfiguration is completely normal when looked up as a whole inside of the body. Uh, and so there's a part of the video that talks about how by explicit and stuff we lose the some of the truths that we could have had. So yes, the left hemisphere is necessary for bread basically. And what I mean by bread is trying to get your basic needs. But the more we rely on it, the more we explicit stuff and the more we strip stuff from the whole that it pertains into, the more we get into something that is not desirable. And I will get into that more and more throughout this video. Okay. Okay, so a part of the video talks about imagination and intuition and a lot of stuff, but it equates the people that say that intuition as being wrong. And I think that intuition is a thing of the right hemisphere, more of in the right hemisphere than the left one. And so these people that say that intuition is wrong just because of some scenario that they've witnessed or some counterexample of as to why intuition is a bad thing, trusting in it. Dr. Ian equates that to saying that optical illusions are sometimes misleading. Therefore, you shouldn't be relying on your eyes or your say your optical senses, and that's the right hemisphere, so the left hemisphere, sorry. Mm. Also, there's a part of the video that talks about how the right hemisphere is the thing that is very important for people that do stuff like riding motorcycles in the Iceman TT, or I don't remember the name, but I know that those guys they're riding in practically the most dangerous race in the world, and they ride in motorcycles which are not the most maneuverable vehicles out there, and they ride in them at very high speeds, very close to walls and everything. And these people, they do that on automatic mode, so they're not thinking a lot about what every part of their moves are. So yeah, the fact that if they start thinking while doing these crazy, dangerous performances, they might die simply. It's like for some pianist doing a complex performance to stop and wonder, I wonder which key I should be pressing next. and that simple conscious thought might lead him to stop playing the piece. And that's what's meant by how these motorcyclists can't stop and think about what they're doing. If they do, they might die. Mm, what else? Okay, so there's a part of the video that also talks about how science is not a bad thing, even when considering the left versus right hemisphere debate. But when considering that science is only mechanistical and algorithmical, meaning that you should go from an introduction and then through your process arrive to the hypothesis that you've set in the beginning, that's misleading because one of the examples that were given for that case is that a student of Dr. Jordan Peterson talked about how they've arrived at a leap of a conclusion based on the hypothesis that they've set, but the conclusion that they arrived at were a result of their intuition, and they couldn't arrive at it without their intuition, but the explanation that they've made in order to get to the result was basically just a wrong justification of how they gotten into it. And that's just to testify to how powerful intuition is. So you can't just say that science should just rely on, I don't know, reason or step by step till it arrives at the final hypothesis. So maybe sometimes science need to be humble and recognize that sometimes the results that it's going to get into are just a hint of intuition. Okay, that's one part of the video that I wanted to also include and talk about. Also, a part of the discussion revolved around the erection and its link with religion, music, beauty, stuff that science can't quantify and can't explain. And usually these things, the left hemisphere is just like, grab me this thing. But I'm not saying that the left hemisphere or the right one is what's responsible to the enjoyment of either of these. So for instance, it's the attention of both of these into these aspects that makes it enjoyable. So you're not only listening to a piece of piano by focusing onto the piece as a whole, nor are you focusing into each note of the piano. You're doing both those things, which makes the piano piece either enjoyable or not. And these things, they can't be, as I've said, neglected, nor can they be explained by science in a simple way. Mm, and they've given the example of digital instruments versus real instruments. So the digital instruments, even though they are defectuous or not working properly, you can feel your way through playing them and make them give a good result. Whereas a digital instrument, usually it's either one or not. It's either one or zero, works or doesn't work. That's the idea that I've gotten from it. And one thing that is really, really blown my mind, it's not that it blown my mind, but I was conscious of this thing since I'm not a native English speaker, and they were talking about how Indian music, for some people that are not Indian who listened to that music and they understood what it meant. The reason they understood that is not something that can be explained by science. It's not that they understood what it was said completely 100%, but they felt what was said and they maybe approximated what was being said. And as I've said, as someone who wasn't a native speaker of English, and so there were some English lyrics of songs like the ones of Linkin Park and what else? Eminem, a lot of these musics that I was listening to, and I understood what they were expressing. And when once I started understanding English, it felt as if I always knew what these songs were meaning. And it's a crazy thing. You have to experience it to know what I talk about. Uh, Basically, speech is a thing that okay, so I'm going to move on to another point of the video. So speech is a more of a left hemisphere thing, and that's not enough to dismiss the validity of how music could have been the initial speech. So when people are talking, they use their voice in different way. They use intonations, they use exclamations and tonalities that makes up what they mean and how they mean it and everything. So that thing is similar to music, and that's the nuance. Like, is music more of a right hemisphere thing or is it more of a left hemisphere thing? It's both actually. And what is the last thing that I've written here? Paralyze or yeah. So yeah, it's a small note which I've already talked about in the beginning of the video, which is that you might have your arm paralyzed, and that's a left hemisphere thing. Left hemisphere damage thing, but still not deny its existence. But if you have a right hemisphere damage and that place is related to your arm, you might completely deny the existence of your arm, even though you can still move it, which is weird. So yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about, and I've completely forgotten about this concept of the right and left hemisphere, but I still made a video of contrasting the metaphysical and physical, and I completely forgotten that there's a lot of concepts that could be derived from these two. So, right hemisphere is more of a controlling thing, and right hemisphere is more of a true thing. And since these what do I call them? These spiritual slash esoteric slash psychological knowledges maybe. They are all pointing to the same things, even though sometimes they are called with the opposite name. So in the book Psycho-Cybernetics, for instance, the author talks about how the subconscious is more of a servant to the conscious mind, while in the book of the master and the emissary, I think that the subconscious is considered more of the master than the servant. The overall meaning is the same as long as you're contrasting these concepts. They point to the same thing, and that's what I wanted to talk about. Thanks for listening.